Hello, today I want to explain how I was diagnosed with celiac disease and basically what celiac disease is and what gluten is and why do some people have to avoid gluten. So what is celiac disease? So celiac disease is an autoimmune disease where if a celiac eats 20 parts per million or 1 crumb of gluten, their small intestine will become damaged. And the small intestine is the longest intestine in your body, and it's where your body absorbs most of its nutrients. So your small intestine has these tiny little hair-like projections lining its walls that are called villi. And these villi are actually what absorb nutrients for you. And what happens when a celiac eats gluten is your body attacks itself and actually attacks these villi and flattens them. So you're obviously not able to absorb nutrients anymore. So the other thing that happens is that the part of your body that produces the enzyme, lactose or lactase? Lactase, the enzyme that breaks down lactose. So the part of your body that produces that enzyme is also in your small intestine and can become damaged. So a celiac can be temporarily lactose intolerant until the villi in their small intestine start healing. So something else I find that people get very confused about is what on earth is gluten? So gluten is actually a combination of 2 proteins that are commonly found in wheat, rye, barley, and malt and things like that. And these 2 proteins, I don't know how to pronounce them, but these 2 proteins are called gliadin and glutenin. A common misconception I also hear about celiac disease is that there's different levels of how sensitive a celiac can be to gluten. But according to the Canadian Celiac Association, which does keep up with the latest science, every single celiac, if they consume 20 parts per million or 1 crumb of gluten, will damage their intestines. Now, the confusing thing about celiac disease is that there's such a wide range of potential symptoms before somebody gets diagnosed. So the most common symptoms, of course, are weight loss and diarrhea because your small intestine can't absorb any nutrients. But there's a massive list of potential symptoms. So some of the common symptoms of celiac disease are fatigue, bone or joint pain, arthritis, osteoporosis, liver and biliary tract disorders, depression or anxiety, seizures or migraines. This is part of the reason why celiac disease can be so difficult to diagnose, because it can present itself so differently in different people. So, for example, for me, I actually didn't have diarrhea and weight loss, even though those are the most common symptoms. I had extreme bloating, even after eating a small meal. I would look like I was pregnant kind of bloating, no more jeans, only leggings. I'm still recovering from being addicted to leggings because of it. Very serious. So thankfully I went to my doctor and got tons of tests done, and the one that came back strange was a blood test. So what they're testing for in this blood test is high levels of tissue transglutaminase antibodies. So if you have high levels of these antibodies in your blood, it's likely that you have celiac disease. So then you go on to get a biopsy. So I got an endoscopy where they put stuck tubes down both ends. The top one, they were checking out my esophagus to see if it was damaged from acid reflux. And then the bottom one, they were taking a little biopsy of my small intestine to see if there's any damage. And this is the gold standard for diagnosing celiac disease, is doing this biopsy. Because if you look at the small intestines and they are flattened, it's extremely likely that celiac disease is the cause. So my test came back positive, and I've been gluten-free for a year now. Actually, last October is when I was diagnosed. Something else about celiac disease is, as I said, it takes 20 parts per million or 1 crumb of gluten to damage a celiac's intestines. So this means that you cannot eat food that has touched gluten. So you can't eat food that's been prepared on a surface that wheat has touched or gluten has touched. You can't eat food where somebody used a ladle to stir glutinous pasta and then maybe use that ladle to stir your food. So after being gluten-free for a year, I definitely have some tips that I hope will help out a newly diagnosed celiac. So the first thing that I want to emphasize is I really don't recommend going online and reading about what contains gluten. I'm so sorry, my nose is so itchy. So I do not recommend reading blogs about what is and is not gluten-free. In my experience, from everything I've learned, there is just so much misinformation and so many personal anecdotes where often a celiac may get sick from gluten and tell their story on a blog, but they're very confused about what actually caused them to get sick. For example, one time I read a blog post about this guy talking about how he had rum and a sausage and how he got sick, and so he recommended to not eat rum because he was sure that the spices in rum can have gluten. I signed up for the Canadian Celiac Association, which explain that across studies, hard alcohol with no additives, so 40% liquors like tequila, vodka, rum, are always gluten-free because of the distilling process, whereas sausages commonly have wheat added to them to hold them together. So that's just one example of the kinds of things you'll read online. What I do recommend doing is joining your country's Celiac Association or Celiac Society, because they will keep up to date on the latest science, and they're the ones that are lobbying to the government to get labeling laws changed to make it easy for celiacs to buy food at grocery stores. When I signed up with the Canadian Celiac Association, they sent me a letter that dispelled a lot of common myths about the sorts of things that do contain gluten. One of them was that envelope sealant contains gluten, so you can't lick an envelope to shut it. That's not the case. Another one is that caramel flavor often contains gluten. That's just not the case. Another one is that grated cheese often has wheat in it to help keep it separated. Again, it's just not the case. One of the mistakes that I made was not signing up for my country's Celiac Association until about 2 months after I was diagnosed. And during those 2 months, it was so confusing. I was, whoa, it's snowing. Anyways. During those 2 months, it was super confusing. I was reading tons of blog posts, really not understanding what did and didn't have gluten. Everybody has a different idea about what does and does not have gluten. Something else that's really helpful is that your Celiac Association should send you the details on how to read a label in your country and what the labeling laws are. I found that I was just kind of reading ingredients and being like, does natural flavor have gluten? And then I Googled it, and some people would say, oh yeah, natural flavor can have gluten, that sort of thing. And it's just not the case. In Canada, for example, you cannot hide gluten in something like natural flavoring. Something else that I really wish somebody would have told me when I was first diagnosed is that it can take a really long time to get better. I'm coming up on a year of being gluten-free, and I'm only just starting to get better now. And I found that it was very difficult to tell that I was getting better because it was such a slow, gradual process. That's the thing with celiac disease, is that it's so different for everybody. Some people will start to feel great the very next day, and some people like me, it can take up to a year. Something else important to keep in mind about celiac disease is that although every single celiac cannot eat 1 crumb of gluten because it will damage their intestines, some celiacs will feel no symptoms at all, and some of them will be extremely ill before the diagnoses and after they go on a gluten-free diet. So I know some celiacs where if they even eat a small amount of gluten at a restaurant, they'll be feeling it and they'll have to run to the washroom and probably vomit. And other celiacs never felt anything. And just because you don't feel any symptoms, that does not mean your intestines are not being damaged. Something else I definitely recommend is not going gluten-free unless a doctor tells you to. Of course, there's lots of trends to go on a gluten-free diet nowadays. But in my experience, most gluten-free alternatives have way less fiber and way less nutrients and are just empty and not filling to eat. So gluten-free bread, for example, it often tastes like an old sweet kitchen sponge, and it will not fill you up. I find myself being much, much hungrier after eating gluten-free cereals or gluten-free breads. Plus, I'm not getting fiber and I'm not getting those nutrients. So again, I would not recommend doing it unless a doctor recommends that it is healthy for you. And I'm sure that a doctor would only recommend that if you have celiac disease, a gluten allergy, or non-celiac gluten sensitivity. And all those things need to be tested for. So again, I would not recommend going gluten-free unless a doctor tells you to. Something else important is that if you think that you have celiac disease, I highly recommend getting tested. I know some people, if they think they likely have it, or if they get the blood test back, they'll want to go gluten-free right away. But the problem with that is that if you don't have a proper diagnosis, it's so easy to eat small amounts of gluten and just kind of think it's okay. For example, I know someone who thinks she has celiac disease, and she eats fries from a food court that I know are fried in the same deep fryer as gluten because I've asked this establishment. And she eats those fries as a treat semi-regularly. So if she does have celiac disease, then she's eating gluten semi-regularly, and if she doesn't, then she's potentially avoiding gluten for no reason. Another thing, again, that I really wish I would have been told when I was first diagnosed is that it's really not that difficult going gluten-free. I find, especially if you're cooking in your own kitchen, it's super easy. I mean, I basically just have rice instead of bread with meals, and then all the sauces I eat, I just read the ingredients list. Or if it's a sauce that normally has gluten, like soy sauce, I just buy gluten-free soy sauce. So I find cooking at home is super easy. I really want to emphasize that it's not only the super organized, kind of perfect, healthy people that can successfully go gluten-free. I'm not somebody who's naturally organized, and I'm not somebody who would easily be meal prepping all the time. Again, in the years since I've been diagnosed, I haven't once intentionally eaten gluten, and I'm not a naturally organized person. I find that you just get into the routine and the habit of eating gluten-free, and then next thing you know, you're not thinking about it. And I think this is the case with a lot of lifestyle changes. Something else that I found extremely helpful was that when I signed up for the Canadian Celiac Association, they had a meeting for newly diagnosed celiacs, and I brought a bunch of my friends and my grandma and my dad to this meeting just so that they could learn about it as well, because they're people in my life that are going to be eating with me on a regular basis. I mean, eating is a very social thing. And now I find that there's some family members where I can go over for dinner, and for example, on Thanksgiving, there's one set of grandparents I have that made an entirely gluten-free meal for me. And then there's another one that's always like, oh, just have one piece of pie, you'll be fine. And I think that you're just going to encounter this range of people in your life. I'm very lucky that my friends are very understanding, but with relatives, I just have to deal with who understands and who doesn't. So one side of the family, I have to bring my own food on Thanksgiving, which I usually order sushi, which I like more than turkey anyways, because turkey's dry, don't kill me. And then the other side of the family, they make an entire turkey dinner gluten-free for me. So educate your friends and family as much as possible, but then after a certain point, I think you just have to accept that some of them aren't going to get it and some of them are. So I hope that this could be helpful to maybe somebody who's been recently diagnosed with celiac disease, or somebody who knows somebody who's been diagnosed, or somebody who's just super curious, like, what on earth is celiac disease? What on earth is gluten? Why do some people have to avoid it? So I'll also put the links to the Canadian Celiac Association down below. I can obviously recommend them because I've joined and they've been phenomenal and super helpful. And I hope that this video was a little bit helpful, and I plan on doing more kind of silly videos in the future, so stay tuned and thanks for watching. Bye!